As we get started, we wanted to acknowledge that while this workshop was initially designed for Asian participants, we welcome all who are here. We want to share that this workshop is a collaboration and is one of a three-part series exploring the complex relationships with race, racism, and allyship with the Black community. So without further ado, I wanted to pass the mic to PACL.
Thank you, Suk. In light of recent events on anti-Black violence and police brutality, many of us have been grappling with what is our role in this movement. Particularly for Asian Americans, we have a long legacy of solidarity with the Black community, as well as deeply ingrained notions of anti-Blackness. We're here to talk about that today. We're the Pan-Asian Coalition for Liberation, or PACL, and we're a group of medical and dental students at Harvard who came together after noticing that there was not a space for these types of conversations. Can the members of PACL please drop their introductions into the chat now? Awesome, thank you guys. We started this organization because we're still learning ourselves about how to engage in racial justice, and hope that this workshop and organization will be an ongoing and collective process of growth for the Pan-Asian community. We use Pan-Asian to refer to anyone who identifies as Asian, including East, South, and Southeast Asian, Pacific Islanders, and more. We are also incredibly grateful for our peers at UCSF for helping us put together this workshop. Now we're going to ask everybody in the audience to open up your chat and please introduce yourself, who you are, your preferred pronouns, where you're zooming from, and if you're comfortable, how you racially identify. And as everyone is typing in their introductions into the chat, please take a moment to look at the chat and note where people are coming from, which identities are present here, and what this means. As Suk mentioned, today's workshop is the first of a three-part series. In today's workshop, we hope to learn and grapple with the historical origins of Asian American identity and model minority myth, as well as learn historical examples of Asian American and Black American solidarity and conflict. In the following workshops, our goals will be to learn skills for becoming effective allies and accomplices in liberation, and to grapple with our internalized anti-Black racism. We want to recognize that we're all in this together and collectively working toward a better world. I'll be the first one to say that I'm not perfect, and I'm continually unlearning racism. During this workshop, we will be hosting several breakout sessions with small groups, and we know that this may be different on Zoom than in person, but we're asking that you try your best to engage. To have honest conversations here in this space today, we want to set some community norms. We recognize that we're all coming from different places, awareness levels, and knowledge, and that is okay. If you have a question, please don't be afraid to ask. This is a welcoming space. What's said here stays here. We ask that you bring your baggage with you. Don't try to prove that you're not racist. Bring your prejudices, your shame, and your stories. With that in mind, we as facilitators of this workshop will name and challenge statements that deflect racial discomfort so that we can all learn and grow from this. In this workshop, we want to embrace feelings of discomfort to find our growing zone, not our comfort zone. It is important to hold each other accountable for the impact of our words and actions. No hate speech will be tolerated. In this workshop, we'll be covering triggering materials such as police violence, so if at any time you would like to take a moment to process and decompress, feel free to step out or message any of the hosts with any concerns you have. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them directly to Emily Zhang. We will do our best to address them during our session, but if we don't get to your question given the time constraints, we'll follow up with you afterward. Please leave us a way of contacting you if you would like us to follow up. So we know a lot has been going on in these past few months and for a lot of history. We wanted to do a little intro activity check-in as a way to ease into this space. If you'd like to share, please go to the Poll Everywhere link on this slide and tell us what emotions and thoughts you've been having or what motivated you to join us today. Your responses will be anonymous, and you can share words or phrases either via the website or via text. Thank you everyone for sharing. We'll do our best to address and further unpack what is on your mind during this workshop.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome back from your breakout groups. So the first topic that we're going to go over is a little bit of historical context on the term Asian American and our community in general to help us understand how we've gotten to where we are today and also help us imagine how we can move forward. So Asian American was first coined in 1968 by the Berkeley students Yuji Ichioka and Emma G, who founded an organization called the Asian American Political Alliance, or AAPA. They felt that it would be powerful and important to create a cohesive Asian American identity, especially as it related to obtaining political goals. Importantly, this political Asian American this identity was conceived as a political one, and it was also created not only to advocate for issues that impacted just Asian Americans, but also to stand in solidarity with other movements. For example, the AAPA worked with other minority student coalitions to form the Third World Liberation Front and conduct student strikes, which ultimately resulted in the creation of ethnic studies in universities across the country. Members of the AAPA were also directly inspired by other activists from the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers. Although the AAPA started in 1968 and originated the term Asian American, this racial identification was not widely really used until after the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. He was murdered by two white men who were upset with Japan for the loss of auto industry jobs, which galvanized various Asian ethnicities across the nation to recognize their commonalities within the American racial hegemony and organize together. Finally, we want to recognize that the main ethnicities of the students who originally organized with AAPA were Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. The Asian American umbrella today and back then is, of course, broader, more vast, and more diverse than this, and it's a topic that deserves its entire own discussion, but unfortunately is not the focus of our conversation today. We also want to recognize that while Asian Americans a political identity, it's also a reactive one that's partially based on white conceptions of the borders of nation states and race and ethnicity, as demonstrated by the Vincent Chin incident. This context contributes to the complexity and diversity of who is considered Asian today. So as the topic today is our shared histories, it's also vital to understand how the model minority myth shapes Asian American relations both within our own community and with other people of color. So to start off with, the definition of model minority myth is this idea that Asian Americans, which are often conceptualized as East Asians within the US, enjoy a higher level of quote unquote success across academic, economic, and cultural domains in comparison to other racial and ethnic minorities. Within this context, success refers to the conventional understanding of it, which includes like making a six-figure salary, attending an Ivy League institution, etc. I think even if we aren't aware of the specific term, many of us are at least unconsciously aware of this dynamic or can think of examples in our own lives that have been impacted by the model minority myth. It's important that we recognize this idea as a myth and also understand its origins as a strategic and political tool. Many will claim that the economic position of Asian Americans, especially East Asians, is due to their supposed emphasis on the importance of education and family values. Not only is this empirically not true, ideas surrounding education and family are often used as racist, anti-Black dog whistles and feed into the myth of American meritocracy and the idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. This obscures the impact that historical and institutional racism and active violence against community of colors has. What the economic status of Asian Americans did coincide with was reframing of the perception of Asians by white America, as well as the institution of certain immigration policies that favored highly educated immigrants. The first article that was credited with formally establishing the model minority was titled Success Story Japanese American Style and darkly compares Japanese Americans with Black Americans. Alongside this media campaign, the 1952 and 1965 Immigration Acts both set up category preference systems for immigration candidates with professional backgrounds, heavily influencing the socioeconomic and class background of many of the East Asians, especially Chinese Americans, who immigrated to the US, which impacts the makeup of Asian American communities today. This also emphasizes the importance of discussing that not all immigration stories are the same. Basically, the concept that selected migration, in other words, choosing to immigrate to the US, is very different from a history of forced enslavement. These tactics were done purposefully to denigrate the civil rights movement and the concerns of Black folks, as well as to curry favor with China as its geopolitical power increased during and after World War II. The model minority myth continues to be pervasive not only within white American thought, but also is internalized within our own communities, and more generally, homogenization of the Asian American community and continued violence against Black folks. This myth is important to understand as it's one of the main vehicles by which anti-Blackness is propagated within our own community. Somia and Jamie B are now going to talk about the Harvard Affirmative Action lawsuit, which is an example of how the model minority myth continues to be used to oppress Black people and how our own communities internalize this myth and support racist white hierarchies.
So, as Jamie pointed out, the concept of the model minority myth is often used as a tool to propagate anti-Black agenda. And a more recent and prominent example of this was the 2019 Harvard admissions lawsuit. Many of you probably followed the case in the media, but the basic details of the case are that a group of Asian American students who had been rejected by Harvard banded together to join the organization Students for Fair Admissions, or SFFA. Their primary claim against Harvard was that the college intentionally discriminates against Asian Americans and has not adequately explored race-neutral alternatives to increase the diversity of the student body. However, it is important to note that SFFA was actually created and led by conservative activist Edward Bloom. Bloom has had a long history of challenging civil rights and more recently has really focused on trying to dismantle affirmative action. In 2015, he actually led a very similar case against the University of Texas, but at that time had represented a young white woman and had lost the case. So instead, he shifted his focus to using Asian American students. And by doing so, he really used SFFA as a means to pit Asian American students against other students of color in order to promote an anti-affirmative action agenda. One of the key points Bloom kept emphasizing was that data from Harvard's Internal Research Office found that Asian Americans often received lower personal ratings from the admissions officers such as humor and grit. And while it is true that this implicit bias may exist, that does not dismiss the fact that the percentage of Asian American students accepted to Harvard has actually increased over the past several years and is higher than the percentage of Asian American students in the general population. And it also does not condone the choice of Asian American supporters of the lawsuit to engage in anti-Black rhetoric, such as that they are more qualified than other students of color.
I also personally knew someone who was involved in this lawsuit, a Chinese American student at my undergraduate institution. It's important to note that he really felt that he was looking out for Asian American interests as well. Seeing him take part in this lawsuit showed me how Asian Americans were being pitted against other minority students and how we willingly bought into this conflict. Yet there was hardly any mention of legacy and athletic admissions, which are overwhelmingly white.
And while this case obviously focused on undergraduate admissions, this type of anti-minority rhetoric was something that I also had heard a lot about when applying to medical schools, when the reality is that the percentage of Asian Americans accepted to med schools has increased while Black, Latinx, and Native American students continue to be underrepresented in the medical profession. And I just wanted to point out that on the flip side, there was also a lot of strong support from Asian American Harvard students for affirmative action. Some Asian American students testified to how they themselves have benefited from race-conscious admissions, and many Asian American student groups on campus protested against the lawsuit. Hassan Minhaj also made his first episode on the show Patriot Act about discussing the racist agenda being propagated by Edward Bloom, and I definitely recommend watching the show if you want to learn more about how the case unfolded. Nevertheless, the fact that SFFA was created indicates how many Asian Americans still ascribe to the model minority myth and can perpetuate anti-Black racism.
As mentioned earlier, the term Asian American often elicits a mental image or assumptions about people traditionally of East Asian or occasionally South Asian descent, often eliminating visibility and experiences of Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, and underrepresented Asian Pacific ethnicities such as the Lao, Hmong, Cambodian, and Fijian communities. The false characterizations of Asians as a model minority also fails to acknowledge differential challenges within the demographic and masks the difficulties faced by refugee, low-income, and other disadvantaged Asian populations. So what is data disaggregation? It's basically the further subdivision of data into specific categories, in this instance, Asian ethnic groups. so that the underlying trends masked by the big and general data sets can be uncovered. Disaggregation can be accomplished in two ways, either by categorizing and splitting up the data after the fact or by incorporating questions regarding ethnic identity or other such subcategories at the point of data collection. Disaggregated data can highlight population trends and inequalities within a larger group that may otherwise not be recognized and thus not addressed. For example, Asians are assumed to have greater educational achievement and an overall higher income as opposed to the rest of the population and other folks of color. However, as evident in the figure shown, the differences in Asian median household incomes are far-ranging, with Filipino, Asian Indian, and Taiwanese households typically earning greater than $75,000 a year, while Bangladeshi, Nepalese, and Hmong and Burmese households earn less than $50,000 a year. Similar differences based on ethnicity exist in context of education attainment, families living below the poverty line, English proficiency, amongst others. Pan-Asian activists and organizations such as the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAPI Data, and South Asian Resource Action Center have been fighting to disaggregate data under the umbrella term Asian American to better understand these differences and challenges so we can more equitably serve the marginalized populations within our community. Lack of disaggregated data also inhibits the ability to solicit specified funding to address these prevailing issues. State-level bills have sprouted across the country, such as the California Bill AB 1726 and the Massachusetts Bill H 3361 due to work from these activists. However, responses to these bills have not always been positive. A small yet vocal minority of primarily first-generation Chinese immigrants who organized through WeChat staunchly oppose any data disaggregation efforts. Some of their concerns include the idea of disaggregation leading to segregation of the Pan-Asian community along ethnic lines, potential abuse of the data by policymakers alluding to instances such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment, and also possible adverse effects for college admissions and hiring practices. They also question the push for data disaggregation specifically for Asian Americans. The US already collects disaggregated data on the Hispanic community based on country of origin, and there has been a local push by Black folks to distinguish Black Americans descended from enslavement and those of the African diaspora. Asian American data disaggregation efforts have been encouraged and advanced by generations of Asian and Pacific activists. These arguments also highlight the ideological divide between longstanding Asian American activists and new Chinese immigrant activists. There already exist differences in health outcomes, education attainment, and relative instances of poverty among Asian ethnic groups. And by informing policy based on data, these inequities can be recognized and addressed more adequately.
And at this point, we want to use breakout groups to discuss some of these questions to start to examine the ways in which we have internalized anti-Black racism. We want to hold the space to share your stories, and we challenge you to be vulnerable. These are some of the guiding questions that may help in your small group discussions. How do you feel about the term Asian American? Do you identify with it? How has your racial and ethnic identification colored your perception and views of race and inequity in America? And how have those views developed over time? And what role has the model minority myth played in framing your thoughts? To start off, we facilitators will continue to share our own stories of how we have internalized anti-Black racism in the past. And I would like to hand the mic to Jamie B to share her story with us. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, hopefully everyone had a very meaningful discussion. And now we're going to be moving into the background portion of our workshop, and we'll be discussing more about the history between Black and Asian communities. And I'll start off by talking a little bit about examples of tension and solidarity between South Asians and African Americans. First, I think it's important to acknowledge something that is not often talked about in the South Asian community and the Asian American community at large, and that's Mahatma Gandhi's anti-Black rhetoric. It's very well documented that when Gandhi was a young man, he spent time in South Africa, and he had a lot of written works that documented some of his anti-Black rhetoric, including quotes saying that white people there should be the predominating race, and also saying that Black people are troublesome, dirty, and live like animals. And I think we as a South Asian community have to acknowledge this racism and anti-Black rhetoric, and how much of this rhetoric still continues in our communities today, and how much of this, not only the anti-Black rhetoric, but also aligning with whiteness, really continues today. And I think one of the most well-known examples of solidarity between South Asians and African Americans is something that we all learn in school, and that's Martin Luther King Jr.'s use of Gandhian nonviolence. But there are many other examples of connections between the Indian freedom movement and the civil rights movement here in America. For instance, Bayard Rustin, who was the lead organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, was an ally of South Asian liberation movements, and he founded the Free India Committee, which stood on the side of India against the British Empire. And there were many other Black American activists like W.E.B. Du Bois and Langston Hughes, and even organizations such as the NAACP, who all supported the Indian freedom movement. And likewise, there were many Indian freedom fighters who supported the civil rights movement, such as Nehru, who was India's first prime minister, and also Ram Manohar Lohia, who was an Indian politician who went to jail fighting Jim Crow while he was on a visit to the US. And overall, South Asian America as we know it today is possible because of the civil rights movement. And basically in the 1920s, immigration from non-white countries was restricted via the national origins formula, and non-white immigrants were generally not allowed citizenship. But the civil rights movement in the 1960s brought attention to these racially motivated policies, and it was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which opened up immigration to all Asian countries and got rid of restrictive quotas. And it was passed largely against the backdrop of the civil rights movement and due to pressures from the movement to de-racialize American policies. And South Asian communities today continue to exist and thrive due to the work of Black, Brown, and Asian activists fighting oppression. And the last point I'd like to make is that there are many parallels between the racial hierarchy in America and then the caste system in India. And for those of you who don't know, caste is a hereditary social class that restricts the occupation of members of that particular caste and their association with members of other castes. And at the bottom of the castes are a group known as the Untouchables, or the Dalits. And B.R. Ambedkar, who is the chief architect of the Indian Constitution and a very well-known civil rights activist of the 20th century, fought for the rights of Dalits. And he said that his work was largely influenced by the civil rights movement here in America. And Martin Luther King is even quoted having said that we call it race in America and they call it caste in India.
So, hi everyone, my name is Jason. So our Asian American communities now would be radically different and less diverse if not for Black activists. So I want to draw your attention here to an image of a 1970 full-page ad in the New York Times, led and signed by 80 Black leaders, urging the US to significantly expand immigration specifically for refugee communities impacted by US violence. So many of us and our families would not be here today without the work and labor of Black activists, which they put into solidarity efforts, even though this was not directly a Black issue. And as Ja was mentioning, Black activists fought for the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. To really drive the impact of this home, we found out that their efforts led to an almost 10-fold expansion of Asian American immigration. So from 1820 to 1965, only 1.5 million Asians immigrated to the US. But after 1965's Immigration Act, more than 10 million Asians have immigrated to our shores. So Black activists also had a deep impact on Yuri Kochiyama, who was one of our earliest and most prominent Asian American activists in the 1960s. So she began much of her political education through learning from Black activists and leaders as one of the few Asian Americans in the room through organizations like the Harlem Freedom School, as well as the Black Power movement. And one of her most famous friendships was actually with Malcolm X. Through disagreements and arguments, Malcolm X and Black revolutionary leaders were known to welcome Yuri like one of their own and spent large amounts of time educating and connecting her. As a result, she and early Asian American activists drew directly from the Black Power movement to found and drive the beginnings of the Asian American movement. So with Black activists, they successfully achieved major gains in fighting for civil rights, expanding ethnic studies across the country, and winning reparations for Japanese American incarceration. And so for me, two things really stuck out to me. I think first, the beginnings of the Asian American movement drew inspiration, education, and allyship from Black activists and all their efforts. I think second, we can learn from Yuri, who came into Black spaces wanting to learn more, even if it feels uncomfortable to be one of the only Asians in the room. We can draw from her example and join community organizations, sitting in on meetings of Black student and employee groups and offering help when invited, and actively reaching out to coalition build beyond simple social media or simple lip service.
And as Jason pointed out, there are historical moments of Asian American and Black solidarity. However, we still have a long way to go. As a Korean immigrant, I have heard a lot about the LA riots of 1992. It was mostly in the context of how Koreatown was destroyed, incurring over $400 million in damages, that the police never came to defend us, and that Koreatown served as a barrier, a shield for the rich white neighborhoods. As many of you guys may have heard about, LA Uprising rose in response to the acquittal of 4 police officers who brutally attacked Rodney King, an unarmed Black man, which was videotaped and broadcasted on TV for the world to see. But focusing on the beating of Rodney King as a sole cause of LA Uprising helps the narrative that Asian Americans are the victims of race war between Blacks and whites. What is less talked about is the killing of Latasha Harlins, then a 15-year-old Black girl who was shot and killed by a Korean store owner, Sunja Do, who accused Latasha of stealing an orange juice. A week before the LA uprising, Do was convicted and sentenced to only $500 fine and probation, but no jail time by a white judge. What happened to Latasha Harlins and the ruling by the court is no different from what had happened to Vincent Chin. Except in this instance, a member of our community was the perpetrator. The uncomfortable truth is that we, as Asian Americans, are part of the system that upholds anti-Blackness, and we benefit from it. And the first step in recontextualizing in the movement that had formed in 1992 LA is reframing it as a rebellion or uprising rather than a riot. We are seeing the same thing happening right now, the condemnation of protests and focusing on so-called violence of the Black Lives Matter movement, when the actual violence is the state-sanctioned murder of Black folks at the hands of the police. The language of the riot is also used as a tool to divide us Asian American and Black communities apart. Moreover, there are also specific instances of Asian American cops taking part in police brutality. In 2015, Peter Liang, a cop of Asian descent, shot and killed Akai Gurley, a 28-year-old unarmed Black man. In response to this, many members of our Asian American community actually protested in support of Peter Liang. They said he was being scapegoated for being Asian. But their logic of, if a white man can kill a Black man without consequence, why can an Asian man do the same thing, unearths just how much we are complicit in these racist structures. And just a few weeks ago, we watched a cop of Asian descent, Tu Thao, who guarded Mark Chauvin while he killed George Floyd. I want to mention here briefly that as a privileged East Asian person who did not immigrate as a refugee, that calling out a Hmong American can also be problematic in its own ways. Our AAPI community is diverse and huge disparities exist within it. However, as long as we are part of the system that oppresses Black people, we still benefit from these structures and policies because of our relatively lighter skin color. We should grapple with this and actively dismantle these systems that subjugate Black people.
So I wanted to share a brief poem by Franny Choi on the subject of Peter Liang.
Last month, Officer Peter Liang was convicted of killing Akai Gurley, an unarmed Black man, in a Brooklyn housing project. Since then, hundreds of Chinese Americans have marched in support of Officer Liang, many of them carrying signs that read, "One tragedy, two victims." If there is a second victim here, it is not you, Peter. If there is a second victim here, it might be Akai's mother, who, like your mother, stayed up late sometimes worrying that he wouldn't make it home. If there is a second victim here, it might be Akai's sweetheart, who, unlike your sweetheart, had to watch her man drown in his body's red unmaking, knowing that no help was on its way, never on its way in the neighborhoods you patrol, Peter. Never a friendly siren, only the iron lockstep of open prison guards like you, Peter. You who thought that keeping your darker brothers shackled in place would be a good job. You who forgot that there is only ever one enemy, though he wears many faces. And the same God who put Akai into those projects is the same God who hammered at our accents until our mouths were clean and biblical as stale bread, until we fit into the cogs of this pyramid scheme long enough to climb onto the backs of others, and so reach our scraps, our good jobs, and our decent houses with locks on all the doors to keep out the bad people. And it's true that no one wants to see us alive either. They would rather see us hunched over and suicidal in an iPhone factory, or begging for pleasure at a white man's feet, or not see us at all. But none of that makes you a victim today, Peter. It only makes you a disposable knife, a tyrant's tool. And I will not mourn that justice was served to you. I will only keep demanding that the white versions of you get what you got. I do not hate you, Peter. In the pictures, you could be my brother. You could be any boy at my church. But that's the thing about family, isn't it? That when one of your own acts up, it's your job to call him in. So call in your people, Peter. Call in the crowds. Tell them to come home, to take down their signs. Tell them that we have work to do. Tell them if there is a second victim here, it is not you. It is what was lost between two communities in pain. But unlike the first victim, this one can be brought back.
So that was pretty heavy. So we are going to break everyone out into groups again for 10 to 15 minutes to discuss some of our thoughts and reactions to the poem. So here are some guiding questions, which I also put into the chat that you can reference throughout the breakout group. So first, what is the significance of history, and what role and impact does history play in this discussion and your perspective? Does knowing this history change your perspectives on anything? What are some initial reactions you have to the poem? And were there particular phrases that you especially related to? All right, so we will see you all back in 15 minutes.
Okay. All right, I think we have most folks back, hopefully now. All right, so I hope you guys all had a meaningful breakout discussion, and just gonna continue on. So just to provide some further examples of Black and Asian solidarity, we want to point out that while tension and complicity surrounding mass incarceration exists in the Asian American community, we are hopeful that we can work in solidarity with Black communities to reach goals of abolishing the police. Our legacy of solidarity with Black communities remains strong. There are so many examples where we can draw strength to fight around these intractable issues. These are just 3 examples highlighted by an artist and sociology PhD student, Bianca, that some of you guys can read about. The first is how communities of color united to fight for ethnic studies across the country. The second is about how US Black soldiers actually joined Filipino forces to keep the Philippines free from American imperialism. And the third is how Vietnamese and Black communities successfully fought against environmental injustice after Hurricane Katrina.
So what does effective solidarity even look like? We will be sure to cover this topic in greater detail in our future sessions, but for now, we really want to emphasize that we are sharing all this history with you today to encourage you to move away from symbolic solidarity, which includes virtue, signaling, and lip service. We also want to point out that approaching solidarity like a transaction, such as extending support only to those who you feel personally indebted to, like, oh, this community supported me in the past, so therefore I'm going to support them now. We feel that this type of transactional solidarity does not necessarily lead to long-lasting change and collective liberation. So instead, we really hope that you take away from the session a desire to practice transformative solidarity, in which you view yourself as part of a collective intersectional community, and that everyone's struggle is deeply intertwined with yours. So transformative solidarity supports everyone, not just some of us. And this means that liberation for Black and other marginalized communities is also liberation for you. So we believe that it's really critical that you identify and relinquish your own privileges by fighting to dismantle these systems of oppression in all their forms, even if someone else's oppression seems to benefit you. And one example of this is mass incarceration and the criminal justice system in the US, which are some very clear examples of structural racism and violence against Black and Brown communities. We must, as Asian Americans, actively strive to abolish police, even if policing may personally give you a false sense of security.
So we know that we've covered so much in this presentation and in our breakout groups, so we invite you all to share some of your takeaways or lessons learned in the larger group chat. In the meantime, we'll share some of ours as we developed our workshop. So first, the term Asian American was founded upon political roots and protest, and was actually inspired by Black activists after white society called us Orientals and other racial slurs for decades. And so now this term actually encompasses a huge diversity of identities with varying migration stories, and it's important for us to push to disaggregate these narratives and dismantle these disparities. Second, the model minority myth has been used to erase these struggles and pit us against each other, isolating and dividing us, and even feeding into sentiment that hurts and stereotypes Black people and activism. Third, Black and Asian communities have histories of tension, but also of shared struggle and solidarity that have led to the founding of the Asian American movement. So without Black activists and organizers, Asian Americans would be in a very different place than where we are at today. This history can give us all inspiration to work on social justice issues, but should not be viewed in the sense of, you help me, so we'll help you. Instead, we believe firmly in a collective liberation, as Hillary was mentioning, meaning that all of our struggles are interconnected, and centering those who are most oppressed in our activism benefits and liberates all of us. In other words, centering and fighting alongside Black Lives Matter also means fighting for all of us, including immigrants and Asian Americans, in the same way that fighting for racial justice means fighting for economic and climate justice. I love this quote from Lilla Watson, an Indigenous activist, who said, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." So thank you all for thinking about takeaways as well as sharing them in the chat. We'd like to do one last breakout session where y'all can discuss your takeaways and lessons learned for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. Here are some guiding questions. What are your takeaways? What is the value of learning our differing and shared histories? How can we continue educating each other, whether that be classmates, colleagues, or family members, about our histories of solidarity? So this will be the last breakout session. All right, thank you all so much for sharing, and thank you for being vulnerable and sharing throughout this entire workshop. As we end this presentation, we wanted to make sure to say a series of thank yous. And so first is to our volunteer facilitators who really lent us our time and energy, and this isn't really an easy job. And so I really want to thank and acknowledge them. Second is to our UCSF organizers who've lent us their facilitating guides, as well as ideas for facilitating more honest conversation, as well as their wisdom. Black activists, of course, who have given us their words, art, labor, and work, who've educated us, provided the foundation for this presentation, and who we center in this work. Also, the generations of activists who've demonstrated what it means to be in solidarity and who we learn from and follow today.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, PACL, for leading this workshop. So as we wrap up, we wanted to leave you all with this graphic. Self-care is a radical act. And if you care for yourself, you might be able to help care for others too. So if you guys have any questions or feedback, you can contact us at any of the accounts listed below. For updates on our Black Lives Matter webinar series, please check the MGH-CCC-SEW Facebook page, and you're also welcome to reach out to me directly on Twitter. With that said, thank you again so much for attending today's session. Please fill out the quick poll that Jason put up so we can continue to approve our content. We're also going to be following up with an email with the webinar recording, our resource list, and a form where you can share further comments and questions, as well as indicate any interest that you may have with getting involved with PACL. Thanks, guys. We'll see you soon.